I'd like to welcome you to the New Jersey Institute of Technology Cyber Psychology Spring Seminar Series. My name is Dr. Julie Ansis, and I am the inaugural director of the Cyber Psychology program at NJIT. The Cyber Psychology Seminar Series is designed to showcase the many different facets of research and scholarship within the field of cyber psychology. The series features some of the nation's leading experts at the emerging intersection of psychology and technology. Some housekeeping, please, before we get started. Please keep your mics muted, and we will have a question and answer period in the last portion of today's hour. If you could please put your questions in the chat, and it would be very helpful if you could use the word question in the prefix or Q, so I'm able to differentiate questions from comments. It is a pleasure to have with us today, this morning, Dr. Anastasia Kozyreva. She is a researcher at the Center for Adaptive Rationality, or ARC, at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. She is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist working on cognitive and ethical implications of digital technologies and artificial intelligence on society. After completing her PhD in philosophy at the University of Heidelberg in 2016, she joined ARC to study rationality and decision-making under uncertainty. Her conceptual research focuses on foundations of risk and uncertainty, bounded rationality, and the challenges that modern digital environments pose to human autonomy and decision-making. Dr. Kozyreva's empirical research focuses on public attitudes towards digital technology and cognitive interventions that could help counteract the rising challenges of false information and online manipulation. The title of her talk today is Confronting Digital Challenges with Cognitive Tools. So thank you, welcome you, Dr. Kozyreva. Thank you for being part of this Cyber Psychology Seminar Series, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here as well. Let me share my screen and bear with me while I do that. Okay. So I assume you see my slides now, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, my heart.
I know.
My heart sank. I was so looking forward.
I suggest everybody mute themselves.
I know.
All right, I'm just gonna start. Okay, so as Julie said, I'm working at the Center for Adaptive Rationality in Berlin. And in the center, among other things, we study how the informational context and their designs can affect the choices people make. So the digital world presents a particularly interesting research challenge in this regard, because it is a new environment in which people socialize, search for information, and make decisions. Decisions which, importantly, might have big cumulative effects on the functioning of human societies. So in our paper, which is the basis for this talk today, my colleagues and myself have been looking at precisely this interaction between human behavior and digital environments. So today, after giving a very brief introduction about this new online world, I will talk about the main challenges that digital environments present to human cognition and behavior. And then in the next step, I will turn to the question of how to counteract these challenges and briefly review the types of behavioral and cognitive interventions that can be applied to the digital world, including mostly nudging and boosting approaches. Then I will focus specifically on boosting and describe several examples of cognitive tools which could be used to boost people's reasoning and resilience to online manipulation. And I will end with this general outlook regarding the toolbox approach to the digital challenges. So I would like to start with this example of the two historical events that both happened in 1969. First, in July, the humanity made its first and widely televised step on the moon. In October of the same year, we took another, no less remarkable, but maybe less televised step, namely the step into the cyberspace. Then the first successful host-to-host connection launched the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, online. The connection broke very quickly, but nevertheless, almost 32 years since this first, maybe a little bit awkward step online, the internet has evolved into a ubiquitous global digital environment, populated by more than 4.5 billion people, more than a half of the world population, and entrenched in most aspects of our professional, public, and private lives. Especially in the last year during the pandemic, I think it became obvious to everybody. Moreover, I think it's important to realize that it is no longer possible to see the online world as some sort of separate place, opposed to the real or the physical world. Even though in research, we still regard these two worlds as two different things, distinguishing, for instance, between face-to-face and computer-mediated communication, or between social networks online and offline. At the same time, though, it is becoming increasingly more difficult to separate when one is truly online or offline, a phenomena that philosopher Luciano Floridi calls the Onlife experience. I don't know how good of an expression it is, but I think it indicates that we are looking for this term already that designates the space that connects our online and offline experiences. And the case in point is this event right now, then I'm sitting in my room in Berlin and you're sitting in your rooms in New York or other parts of the world and talking about digital challenges. And of course, this widespread penetration of digital technologies in our life also highlights another trend, namely the trend in the information and news consumption, which is increasingly moving from print to digital media. Which includes not only digital newspapers, but also social media. And we see this on the example in the report by the Reuters Institute that, for instance, in the example of Germany, how the print consumption of news via print went down and online and social media is increasing. And it's happening all over the world. Actually, in Germany, maybe less so than in some other parts. And despite that, it's also important to know that most of the surveys also show that the trust in social media is not very high, mainly the trust in news shared on social media. And it is one of the, Facebook especially, is the most likely source to be seen as the source of the false information or misinformation. Which brings us to another moon story. You probably all heard about this. If you ever read something about fake or false news, this happened in 1835. Then the New York newspaper Sun published a series of completely blatantly false stories about supposed discovery of entire civilization of aliens, or I don't know who they were, living on the moon. This was known as the Great Moon Hoax, which actually brought a lot of readers to this newspaper. But it was important to realize that as big as it was at the time, New York population was still 300,000 people. I doubt we can assume that all of them heard about this story, but it's also fair to assume that probably it didn't propagate as widely. If we fast forward to our time and to the 2016, which is probably the most notoriously important year for the fake news industry, this is then a lot of things started happening, or maybe they started happening even before, but this is then the importance of false information online reach public attention, especially before the informational cycle during the presidential election. Then, for instance, one of the most shared and liked stories on Facebook was the false news story about Pope endorsing Donald Trump for president. So this brings to mind the old saying, namely that falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it, which dates back to the 18th century. After all, I think it's safe to say that we are not the generations of people who invented lying. Lying existed since forever. But in 2018, we got some evidence that it is indeed the case on the social media. Then Soroush Vazorgi and his colleagues showed that false rumors travel faster than true ones on Twitter, and that they need much less time to reach the same amount of people, and they are much more likely to be retweeted. Another apt saying about falsehoods belongs to French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who noticed already in the 16th century that even though facts can be quite straightforward in what they're saying, the lies have 100 faces or 1,000 faces. Or in other words, there is a lot of ways to tell a lie. There is not so much, or maybe just one, to tell the truth. And this is indeed what we see with many phases of online mis and disinformation that contains not only blatantly false and obvious fake news, but also much more persuasive and dangerous half-truth, systemic lies that are deliberately propagated by people with a certain vested interests like fossil fuel industry or tobacco industry, and dangerous conspiracy theories that quite often reach very prominent public, expressed by very prominent public figures, unfortunately. So as for the receiving end of the false information, namely us, people, it is quite hard for us in general to detect deception. And it is even harder online than in the absence of familiar cues and with information overload, with the abundance of information. So that's why there's one quite prominent account in psychology of fake news or false news that is developed by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand. So they propose the inattention-based account and argue that people have even though people have a very strong preference to only share accurate content, the social media context distract them from this preference, and then they fail to discern truth from falsehood because they do not stop and reflect sufficiently on their prior knowledge. And this is not happening because their reasoning abilities are hijacked by political motivations, as there are some other accounts of motivated reasoning that are stating that. So inattention and lack of capacity to stop and reflect on what they're seeing is what actually drives quite often the sharing of false information on social media. And this idea is also received some support in their recent paper, which showed that just shifting attention to accuracy by subtly priming the idea that accuracy is actually important and you share information can decrease intention to share false information and effectively decrease sharing of dubious sources online. So this is just basically a recently last week or a couple of weeks published paper in Nature, a very nice paper. So the importance of attention in online environments is also found on the collective level. So my colleague in our group, Philipp Lorenz Spren, and his colleagues at the time during his doctoral thesis analyzed the dynamics of collective attention that is spent online on cultural items such as Twitter hashtag, Google queries, or Reddit items, Wikipedia, and other things, and showed that across the past decade, the rate at which the popularity of items decreased or increased has grown. To explain this, is probably better to give an example. So, namely, in 2013, a hashtag on Twitter was popular on average for about 17.5 hours, whereas in 2016, its popularity lasted only 12 hours. This suggests, according to the authors, that the amount of collective attention allocated to each single topic is decreasing and more topics are attended to in the same amount of time. So this shrinking attention follows the trend of increasing information abundance, which shouldn't be very surprising, as already in 1971, Herbert Simon wrote that an information-rich world, the abundance of information goes hand in hand with the scarcity of attention. Attention is a limited resource, and we cannot attend to all the pieces of information that are thrown to us. So the more information out there, the less attention we can pay to each particular item. And that's one of the crucial points here. And this is also why many people these days were talking that we're living in the age of the attention economy. And our attention, this very limited resource, is becoming a resource for which different competitors, companies compete in the market for the possibility to serve, to present information in front of our eyes. And I know it's a lot, so maybe let's take it all in. Just to summarize, for now, we were talking about two challenges, the challenge of false information, of fake news, and this is another related challenge of the attention economy and online distraction. We, of course, discuss it in much more detail in the paper. So now I turn to the next challenge, which we call AI-assisted and manipulative choice architectures, right? So what are choice architectures? They are basically everywhere. Every design of a space, be it information space online or physical space, represents a choice architecture for us. Imagine you are on a subway, you need to exit the subway or enter the subway. The way the whole system is designed is what guides your choice where you will go. And the same online, the way the choice results on Google are presented, the way Amazon's present you the options for what you're looking for, basically the consent forms, everything represents a certain choice architecture that guides people's choices towards option that in this case, I guess in most situations would favor the service provider, right? And moreover, online, the additional challenge is that this personalization is aided by the algorithmic filtering. So it's no longer humans who design things, it's also algorithms who sort through all the information and present it to us in a certain way. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's actually a necessary thing, because otherwise it would be just impossible to find anything online. But at the same time, of course, it also feeds on people's digital traces, on our data. And sometimes the danger arises then this choice design begins bordering on manipulation. So this is what I want to underline. Not all choice architectures or experience design online is a bad thing, rather it's a neutral thing. But then it becomes, then it turns towards manipulation, namely this attempt to exercise, to subvert the way people make decisions. This is then it becomes problematic. This is then we stop making decisions the way we want to make them and make decisions based on what service providers sort of designed it to do. And now I'll give a couple of examples so that this becomes much clearer. But if you want to consult like more conceptual piece on online manipulation, check out this paper. It's very nice. It's more a philosophical, conceptual paper, but it delineates these different types of persuasion and manipulation very, very nicely. So one of the most famous probably examples of online manipulation is dark patterns, which is a term coined by designer and user experience researcher Harry Brignall. And they are defined as user interface designs that benefit online service providers by coercing, steering, or deceiving users into making unintended and potentially harmful decision. And they do it in many different ways. So if you want to check out what kind of types of dark partners are there, you can just Google it or check out this very nice web transparency page, which is supported formation for paper by Matur and colleagues that research dark patterns online in quite a detail. And this is just to give you an example I find very nice, like called the dark pattern here called comfort shaming, basically trying to emotionally manipulate you. So the choice is either you turn off an ad blocker or you agree that you are a bad person and you make the teddy bear sad. So, you know, that's how it's done. And there are many other choices. And I must say, even though I am aware of these things and I study these things, I still fall into this trap. I have already fallen into this sort of subscription traps quite a couple of times. So yeah, that's pretty hard. And another thing is, of course, another choice architecture that that I found rather like malicious use of choice architecture is, of course, the privacy settings. So here in Europe, we have a law, general data protection regulation, that actually mandates privacy by default. So basically, any companies and the service providers can only collect necessary data, data necessary for their services to function. And now everybody is presenting you with this, with these choices for cookie settings, for privacy settings, and then of course it's much harder here to. It's one or two steps more to adjust your data settings so that they don't collect all the cookies for you. And the first choice is, of course, just accept all. And this is even not the worst example of it all. There are much more examples. And in this paper, people who actually studied these privacy notifications in the European Union after introduction of GDPR found that more than half use dark patterns, and 86% offer no options besides the confirmation button, which is, of course, like completely outrageous, I find. And moreover, like, why do they do this? Like, why do they need to collect all this data? It's exactly, again, to personalize experience and to serve the better advertisement, better in terms of more successful. And that's how the whole business model functions. But interestingly, nobody has ever asked us, the users, do we actually like that? Do we want our data to be used for personalized experience? So we thought it was not okay not to ask, and we were interested what actually most people think about this. That's why my colleagues and I, we conducted a survey of people's attitudes towards personalization and data collection in online environments. Just let me check the time, right? And there are a couple of things we found, right? So we actually asked separately about acceptability of personalizing the service, such as personalization of social media news feeds or commercial advertisement or music, movies and music. And then we separately asked about acceptability to use different types of information and data. I haven't included data just because it didn't fit into one slide, but it's basically a very similar pattern. So in information, they asked about like your religious view, your sexual organization, political orientation, political views, ethnicity, what have you. And in data, it's your browsing history, the types of words you type in search, with whom you communicate online. So, so very, very close, but not quite the same thing. And then what we found, interestingly, is that, of course, people don't object as much to personalization of services, except for political campaigning and newspapers, which makes sense because this is like our shared information environment. We don't want it to be personalized that much. And they're absolutely fine in most countries, more so in the US and Great Britain, a bit less so in Germany, with personalizing of movies or music suggestions and things like that. And I think it's not at all a surprising finding. It's also, I think, what most of us would think about this. But when we turn to the acceptability of using information or personal data for these same purposes, we find a very different pattern. So much different that we actually even coined a term for this. We call it the acceptability gap in attitudes towards personalization, which we find in all three surveyed populations. Again, more so in Germany, a bit less so in the US, but still present in all three countries, meaning just very simple things. On the individual level, people still find services more acceptable than data or information that is potentially used for personalization. And another thing we found, and I guess it brings to mind this very famous finding in privacy research called the privacy paradox, is this discrepancy between high privacy concerns. So we have in all three countries, 82% of people, independent of political orientation, are either somewhat or very concerned about their privacy. But then if they ask them, do you use these privacy tools? Do you adjust privacy settings? The the rate of usage is much less impressive. Maybe just Facebook privacy settings is the most widely used tool or settings, and others are much less. But we don't really find a paradox here. We find rather a discrepancy or a gap again, because still people who are more concerned about their privacy, their behavior reflects this. They do more things to protect their privacy. So I wouldn't call it about paradox. And what we make out of this finding, so basically our hypothesis, which is still needs to be, of course, studied more carefully, is that what drives this acceptability or privacy gaps is not so much people not caring or being stupid or not being able to protect themselves, but rather that the environments, like in the case of dark partners, really do not help us to make choices that are consistent with our personalization and privacy attitudes. All right. So to wrap up the overview of the challenges, which is just the first part of this talk, I would like to, so this is again the map, and you can find it in the paper where we sort of summarize again all the challenges that we describe in details. And then there's like another additional step here is to understand what cognitive capacities are targeted or involved when we encounter each of these challenges. And this is a very important step when you want to think about interventions, right? Like if you want to counteract the challenges, because in human psychology, it's never just our minds or like our brains and bats, or it's just the environments. It's always interaction between the two. The way we make decisions is affected by the world we live in. And also, like if we want to counteract challenges, we also need to think how people react to this. Are they even capable to exercise control over certain abilities here? And this is particularly the case with distracted environments, or environments that exercise power over us in a way that we can actually not control. So maybe, and this is important, because if we realize that, then we also realize that here, to design appropriate interventions or tools, we shouldn't tell people, look, you have to control your impulses, because that's not going to work. What we have to do is actually come up with tools that help people rearrange their environment in such a way that will be less distracting, which actually would not even demand us to exercise this impossible willpower. And I think this is a finding very well known in studies of addiction and behavior change. You don't change you don't work simply on your willpower. What you actually work on is on your environment, so that it doesn't trigger you so much. All right, so that brings us, of course, to the main question that we're all concerned with, is how to remedy online misinformation and other challenges. And also maybe how to design better online environments to begin with. And I hear myself repeating this phrase over and over again, but it's true. Like there is no silver bullet. There is not just one thing we all can do and say, hey, let's educate people better, or let's design better regulation or better technologies. I think the key here is to understand that there are different ways that are all valid that we can do to address the challenges that we are talking about. And both technology, education, and legal systems have to work together to try to do something about this. And here, and in the paper, we focus on what psychological science or cognitive science can do, right? And in this particular area, in cognitive and behavioral science, we have three more or less prominent approaches, some more prominent than others, but that's what we found. So one is technocognition, and some of them actually like very close to each other. So technocognition and nudging might be the closest, really. So, but basically technocognition, as described by Steve Lewandowski and his colleagues, is it's cognitively inspired technological interventions in information architectures. Basically, we can introduce some friction in the sharing of the offensive material, and that creates barriers for people, for false information to propagate. But so the idea is there that the interventions are inspired by the knowledge about how human behavior and human cognition works, but they are introduced into the technology itself. Another intervention is probably one of the most prominent approaches in behavioral science is nudging. That's what Thaler and Sunstein promoted in their book. And that's probably the most widely used behavioral approach across the world, also by governments. And this is basically interventions in the choice architecture that alter people's behavior. For instance, by changing the default settings or by rearranging the environments in a way that would promote the behavior that choice architects or policymakers want people to do. And I'll give example in a couple of, in the next slides. And then there is another approach, which is boosting. This is what we are doing in our group. And actually the main author of this approach, Ralph Hertwig, is the director of our center, right? So what we are aiming actually more is not so much at the change in people's behavior, but at fostering or improving people's cognitive and motivational competences. And that's going to be the next part of my talk. I'm going to talk how we can develop boosting tools for the online world. So again, this is, I think I'm repeating this a little bit because it's an important distinction. Nudging is about redesigning choice architectures. One of the most famous examples of nudging is the cafeteria nudge, right? You put the healthy foods in, you make them more accessible, more, as they call it, more cognitively accessible. It's easy to reach out. It's easier to put a salad, and you put the foods that are maybe less healthy away so that people don't really use them. And there are many other ways you can nudge people's behavior. But the important point here is the point of entry here is the choice architecture, and the target is the behavior. So the people actually can be completely unaware that anything is happening, that anything is trying to affect their behavior. Behavior just happens, right? They can be aware, they cannot be, but that's not important for nudging. Boosting, on the contrary, it targets cognition. It can target cognition via environment or in any other way. But the idea there is, of course, people have to be aware that this is happening. This is their skills, their competences that are being boosted, so to say. And then the target there through cognition to arrive to autonomous behavior and autonomous decision making. I'm the one making choices consciously to avoid junk food and eat healthy. I don't know. But also what's important there is to understand that idea of boost, it's a bit different from education. It's similar in a way, but it's much more simple. It's more about like simple, easy to understand, easy to remember tools that then becomes more automatic. And the analogy I like to give here is, you know, how we all acquired this competence to cross the street. When we cross the street, there are cars and other dangerous things, and we always look right, we look left, or we wait for the signal and then we go. And this is something like this we need when we talk about our skills and competences for digital literacy, right? We need an automatic behavior that says every time I encounter online information that is suspicious, that is unverified, I do this and that. And this is what boosting tools can help us do better. All right. So, by the way, this is the paper you can check out about the differences between nudging and boosting. And if you want to learn more about educative nudges or boosts, there's basically cues that are added to the environment itself. Again, my colleague, Philip Lawrence Spran, he's a big fan and proponent of this idea of designing better online environments by providing cues indicative of epistemic quality. All right. So Then it comes to the digital world. What we do in our paper, we describe 4 types of interventions. And again, we like to think about this as a toolbox approach. There are different tools for different types of challenges. And they might be well adapted for some challenges, but they might not be adapted to others. And here we can roughly separate them into 2 categories, 2 groups. First includes self-nudging and deliberate ignorance. And this is basically they aim to boost people's control over their information environments and thereby boost their agency and autonomy. So it's not about I exercise superhuman ability to abstain from all destructive impulses, but I actually rearrange environment in a way that helps me not even think about them. And another set of tools aim to boost our reasoning and abilities to discern between accurate and false information, and our resilience to manipulation. And here we have simple decision aids, simple heuristics for digital literacy, and inoculation, which is more preemptive intervention. And hopefully I have enough time to briefly, I think not too much time, but briefly I will talk about them. I think I already said enough about nudging and redesigning an environment that we can already understand what self-nudging is all about. Again, Ralph Hertwig and Samuli Rehula from Helsinki University, they wrote this very nice paper on self-nudging and what it's like to be your own choice architects. But the idea is very similar to how there are choice architects that design environments for us. We can learn from them. We can learn from all the science of nudging, from behavioral science of nudging, and apply this to redesign our own environments. And in the paper we provide, unfortunately I won't be able to talk about all this, but if you want, check it out. We provide several tools inspired by what Center for Humane Technology did. They're actually also very much concerned about this stuff, and they provide some very helpful advice as how it's possible to arrange your smartphone screen, which tool to use.
Anastasia, you just froze. I don't know if it's just me or you just froze for a moment, like 5 seconds. You're good now.
Oh,
you're not frozen anymore.
Where did I stop?
Yeah. You were just talking about this slide and your colleague who created this. It was only like 5 seconds.
All right. So we created this for this paper, but we were inspired by what Center for Humane Technology does. So basically, there are 3 principles that you can take from the nudging research, such as adapting cognitive accessibility, like in the cafeteria nudge, or adjusting defaults, and also using technology. And that's what you can do to self-nudge yourself towards your own goals. And again, this is very preserving of human autonomy because nobody's doing this for you. This is your own decision. And then the next tool, probably the least obvious one, but I think also one of the most important skills that we can foster in the current overabundant information environment is what we call deliberate ignorance, also intelligence ignoring as an information management tool. I say it is counterintuitive because, of course, since the dawn of time, there's a long history of people valuing knowledge, valuing information, and even Aristotle in the beginning of his metaphysics writes, all men by nature, or all humans, we would say now, desire to know, right? But we live in a very different time, in a very different environment. We have all this information at our fingertips. And of course, not all information is knowledge. And so actually the most important skill for critical thinking, or one of the most important decisions we can make for ourselves, is to decide in what we should invest our attention and what to ignore. And Ralph Hertwig and his colleague, Christoph Engel, And in this paper and in the book just released this year, they provide a lot of examples when actually deliberate ignorance or choosing not to know something or abstain for acquiring information can be an adaptive and smart tool to use. And one example is, of course, this oversaturated digital information environments. Then the smart thing to do might be just to choose not to invest your attention in something. Okay. And then, so this was two tools in this first group of tools that are about controlling our information environments, right? The next two tools are about actually sort of heuristic strategies that we can use to improve our capacity to discern between accurate and inaccurate content. And these tools, the ones I like to talk about now, comes from Stanford History Education Group, work done by Sam Weinberg and his colleagues. And they did one thing that I really appreciate. They worked with fact checkers, with professional fact checkers, learning from them what tools they actually use in order to, or not so much tool, like what strategies they use to verify information. And based on this, they suggest these 3 very simple questions that one can ask, and then you encounter information online. It's not like 100 questions or 10 that Facebook tips suggest to you. This is very simple. You just ask who's behind this information, what is the evidence, and what do other sources say? This is one of the most important questions that you can ask here, because what they found is that they compared actually 3 groups of people, students, university students, so smart people, and then also smart people, which were history professors and fact checkers. And I think that Sam Weinberg likes to distinguish them. There are smart people, and then there are fact checkers who are also smart, but who are also smart in the right way in this scenario, right? Because contrary to other groups, they actually didn't spend a lot of time on the source that they were trying to verify. They immediately left the page and they started reading laterally, not vertically, verifying first the information they encounter online. And I'm going to give you an example. So they just also published this new study about students in the US and how good are their digital literacy skills. Not so good, unfortunately. But what was the task, for instance, was the website evaluation task. They were presented with a website, CO2 Science, which I also didn't know. And they had to argue and reason about how reliable they find this information. And 96% of the students in this naturally representative sample in the US received the lowest score on this task, basically just being the beginners, not really knowing what to do, how to verify, how to judge the information they encounter. Because again, what they did, what most people do, they start like investigating, oh, there is this org domain, oh, it's probably very good. Oh, the mission statement says that they disseminate factual reports and sound commentaries. So that sounds legit, right? Wrong. Because just the very simple check outside of the source shows very, very quickly that this website is a front group for the fossil fuel industry, in which only maybe 3% of the sample actually managed to prove in their responses. So, and the idea here is that this lateral reading strategy that they learn from the fact checkers can actually be also become a tool for other people to use, right? Just basically converting this lateral reading strategy into a simple boost. And this can be done just by teaching people this. Look, this is very easy. You just type. If you're unsure, if you don't know who the source is, you should always verify. Just type it in the Google search and you probably see how wrong it is, right? And it can also be embedded in the choice architecture of the website itself, making it easier to use the strategies, just for instance, by adding the search button. Could be done in principle. Something to note at this point, of course, is that no strategy, and we know this from research on simple heuristics, no strategy is ever foolproof. It is adapted to certain environments, but might be completely disadvantageous in others. And of course, if you're dealing with information that has been already fact-checked and there's a lot of Google queries for this, your search will be very successful. But if you're dealing with information that basically nobody has ever heard about or not fact-checked yet, then probably this strategies will not be successful. That's why it's important to also teach when you should use it and then and how to scroll through the Google search results. And that's what also Sam Weinberg and his colleagues do. They develop the whole curriculum around this and show that it actually improves students' ability to reason online. All right, final boost, yes, finally, is probably the one you already know, since you had, as I saw, John Cook among your speakers, so you know about inoculation for sure. That's another tool in our toolbox, which is, again, you know, sometimes it's easy to verify information online. You encounter fishy website, you type in the Google, okay, I see what's the point. But sometimes the way disinformation is disseminated is using very clever strategies that are not as easy to verify. And maybe here inoculation is actually a better tool, and it works like vaccination works, right? Not every vaccination, but it exposes people to a weakened version of disinformation, teaches them what misleading or manipulative strategies are being used out there, and then thereby prevents people from actually being misled when they encounter this online. And they did it with this fake expert, famous strategy, which was used by tobacco industry, showing experimentally that it actually works. And probably the best inoculation example for false information online is done by Sander van der Linden and his colleague in the Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab. This is the bad news game. There you, in a gamified way, you pretend to be the master manipulator, and you learn all the strategies that other manipulators use online. And thereby then you can actually much better recognize then this is coming at you then you scroll through social media. So that's inoculation. And in our group, we also, well, I wasn't part of the study, but my colleagues also showed that inoculation, it can actually be used to boost detection of micro-targeting. So if we assume that there is a person micro-targeting based on type of person you are, you're extroverted or introverted, just by showing people where they are on the scale from introversion and extroversion makes them much better at detecting these ads as the ones aimed at them specifically. And yeah, so this is again like the whole map of challenges, competencies, and tools. And the last thing I want to conclude with would be once again to highlight the importance of the toolbox approach. So I talked about some boosts, some possible boosts. I mentioned nudges, but I don't believe that one of them is necessarily better than another. And the only thing they actually do is test all these interventions and treat them as adapted to different challenges and maybe also different kinds of people. Maybe also age plays a role here so that we actually can develop tools. Some of them maybe like bad news game would be better for younger generations, and for older generations, there will be other tools that are more adaptive, so to say. That's why I think there are lots of people out there working on the intervention approaches. Penny Cook and Andy Gass and van der Linden and many other people, and our groups as well, is trying to make a contribution. So we have this project about reclaiming individual autonomy online, and this paper I presented today is part of this, and another paper in Nature Human Behavior by Philip And this report, which we wrote, Steve Lewandowski and Laura Smiley from European Commission wrote together, also featuring our findings. So yeah, that's, I probably lost too much time on this, but that's it from my side, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for this quite interesting lecture. So if you have any questions for Dr. Kozyreva, please put them in the chat now. I don't see any at the moment, so I'll ask you a question if you don't mind. What are your thoughts about individual differences cognitively, since you're a cognitive scientist, or in the realm of personality that may impact how influential these different interventions or techniques may be? And then you had a slide with extroversion and introversion assessment. Does that relate to my question or not?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, and I think it is a bit different thing. So on the first hand, yes, absolutely, individual differences are important than designing interventions or basically distinguishing which groups of people would be more vulnerable to this. So for instance, there's one very famous finding now from the US saying that that's adults over 60, so basically older adults, who are much more vulnerable to the false news, to fake news. They are the ones who are the most exposed to false news, and they are also the ones who share the most false news, at least in the study of the during the elections. Both on Facebook, I think they find it on Twitter. There's a small percentage of people who share false news, and most of them are older adults. So of course, there are various explanations on why this can happen. And Nadia Brashear, for instance, is one researcher who's doing a lot of work there, or Bryony Swire as well. So these are people to talk to about this. For instance, they are interested in age differences and how this affects fake news. And I do believe that when we design interventions, we have to take this into account, also because there are very different levels of digital literacy for younger and older generations, right? But we also see from the study by Sam Weinberg and his colleagues that younger people are not that great as well when it comes to evaluating online websites. They pay attention to the wrong things, but the way to reach them, the way to reach their attention, it should be probably much different than when we try to reach attentions of the older adults. So I guess the interventions, maybe the idea, like the strategy, like the lateral reading strategy is the same, but the way you communicate it to different age groups, I guess, should be different.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not aware of any studies about personality effects on this. What the study I briefly mentioned is it actually stems from this finding. So there's a paper published in PNAS. Then they found effectiveness of ads served at people based on their personalities. So ads featuring like a woman sitting alone in front of your mirror, it's about cosmetics or something. It's more directed towards introverts, whereas if you're an extrovert, you would be served an ad there. You're at a party and surrounded by lots of people. And that the simple boost was just showing, look, it's possible, but you might be vulnerable to be targeted by these particular types of ads. Is if you realize that you're an introvert, and then you see an ad that targets this particular personality traits, then the moment you know it, it doesn't work on you anymore. So that's the idea. I see it more as a proof of concept, right? We can make people less vulnerable to this just by saying, look, they're trying to manipulate you by using your emotional preferences or your ethnicities or your sexuality or what else. And the moment you know it, I assume the effect of manipulation would be much less strong.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So G. Kai from Informatics at NJIT has a question. Can you explain a little bit more about how to ignore intelligently as information management tools? Any example? This is an interesting tool.
Yeah, good question. An example. I think it's more of, it's not so much like, lateral reading, it's a very easily explainable tool, but I think indeed when we're talking about intelligent ignoring, it's more of a skill, right, that you can develop. Sort of you realize, okay, I'm now in the environment that is attacking me with all information, and I have only that much attention that I can invest in this and that. And if I now spend 2 hours on YouTube videos, then I probably won't spend the same 2 hours on whatever else I find important in my life, right? Spending time with my friends. And then intelligent ignoring is sort of a skill that you can develop for yourself. Like, now I choose not to pay attention to this. And the way it can be used, then probably best used together with some sort of self-nudging, like you limit your screen time in a way, or you just stop following any accounts that you might suspect sharing false news. But that's, I guess that's still an open question of how exactly to implement, or to how exactly this skill can be fostered. So I think I agree that's actually a very important and interesting question, and we are planning to think about this more. But if you have any ideas, please share.
Okay. Diana Schnitzer asks, when people discover they have been sharing fake news, what are the most common responses? Are people most likely to correct it, ignore it, or double down the set out to prove it by sharing more of it?
Yeah, interesting. Good question, actually. I have no idea what people's responses are, because I guess that's very rare that people actually receive any feedback from the environments, then they share it. And if it's a politically aligned false news, they might actually not even be willing to accept it. But Gordon Pennycook and his colleagues have some very good research on differences between truth discernment and sharing of false information, that they found that despite people being actually quite accurate, then you present them the same items in one condition, the discernment between what is false and true is quite good and independent of political orientation. But then you ask them, would you share this? People say, yeah, sure, why not? I will. Again, two different conditions. It's not like you ask them after they said it's inaccurate. But in another study, they also showed that like the moment you introduce accuracy idea to people's minds by whatever subtle intervention, just reminding them about accuracy. In their case, I think people rated some irrelevant pieces of information on accuracy. Then after this, the sharing intentions of false information go down, so the intervention is successful. But there is still a small percentage of people who say, what the heck, I'm still gonna share it, even though they realize they're sharing false. But that's a really small minority, maybe 5% of people, something like that. I think most people do care about accuracy, they do not want to share, but I don't know of any studies that actually look into people's reactions. That I think there are different responses possible, indeed. Can even backfire, probably, as you suggest.
Yeah, and I think of some of the cognitive biases, like cognitive confirmation bias, and the tendency to people to sort of double down in reaction to. But that would be an interesting study. Jen Webster asks, is there anything more policymakers can do to counter misinformation?
More than as opposed to what they're doing now, or more than what I suggested they could? I mean, they could. It's always possible to do more, right?
Yeah.
And they should. And I mean, I know in European Union, policymakers and politicians are very concerned about this, for sure. So we wrote this report for European Commission, and I know they're now designing a lot of regulations. I think in the US, situation is a bit different, right? So you have much more laissez-faire approach towards business models of internet companies, and I mean it's also a respectable position. But I mean, policymakers don't have to be hardcore regulators, right? As, social media companies are also implementing regulation. Maybe it's self-regulation, and but yeah, that's I mean, it's absolutely important to do that. And I think our point is that it's important to do that by consulting science, right? Not just like do whatever comes to your mind by your political motives, but like actually look into what interventions might work, what has been tested, consult all the different great researchers who I mentioned who work in this field, and then I'm sure solution can be found.
So we're at time. I don't want to keep you, but if you don't mind, one more question.
Sure.
So just a comment from Dan Pevney, the browser extension. Stay focused might be relevant. It allows you to restrict the time you spend on sites you select. Thank you for that suggestion. And Manav Mehta has a question. Would using a VPN block dark ads or just mask your IP address?
Yeah, I guess it just masks your IP address, definitely. But I actually have no idea if it will help against dark ads, and probably dark ads are already banned by the platforms. They woke up a little bit to the challenge, so I think there's much more transparency, not enough transparency, but more transparency in what ads are being served to people, and you can actually check it. And there's a lot you can do in the privacy settings to limit personalization. So in Facebook, Twitter, and any platform, you can go to your settings. It takes time, but like do it once, and then you tell them to stop collecting information. But it's not enough because they're still tracking you. I just recently checked Twitter. They have 450 interests on me. I don't know where they got them. Everything is turned off in my settings. They just still somehow follow me through cookies, through whatever settings I click, accept all, and you just like, I cannot even possibly pay attention to this. Happens to all of us.
They're listening. The devices are definitely listening. I don't know, maybe any computer scientist could respond to this last question.
I think I'm not the right person to give you the tech advice.
You have techies on listening to the call. So I want to thank you so much for this really important and very, very timely lecture and discussion and all your wonderful work, and congratulations on your recent APS publication. That's fantastic. So again, my great appreciation to you for joining us
so
all today from Germany. And so,
yes, all the way from Germany,
all the way.
traveling.
All the
traveling across the ocean. Yes.
Exactly. No, but we do thank you for your time, and I thank all the participants who joined us today as well, and want to remind everybody that the next seminar is Monday, April 12th, again, 11 to 12 Eastern Daylight Time. And the topic or the title of the presentation is using big data to study individual differences in spending. And we'll have Dr. Sandra Matz from Columbia University join us for that lecture. So I hope you register for that. Thank you again, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.